I'd like to give you some results of a survey that was carried out in France a few months ago, from July to September 2013. The logo there is the logo of the National Council of Evangelicals in France, to which somewhere between 70 and 80% of all our evangelical churches belong, plus a high proportion of the parachurch movements and so on. So the GBU is also part of this. And my role within the what's called the CNEF is that I chair the Evangelism Commission. This is why I'm probably in the Evangelism Network. And this Evangelism Commission, the CNEF is fairly recent. It was formed 4 years ago, and our Evangelism Commission has only existed for 2 years. So the first thing we wanted to do was to look at the situation and to see where are we today with evangelism. And our first project was to do a survey among all the pastors belonging to the CNEF. Now, we had over 340 answers, which is pretty high to do this kind of survey. When I say 288 complete responses, that was completely responses. The partial responses meant that people ticked the boxes where they could answer yes or no or put things in order, but didn't add any other comments. So we didn't have any qualitative answers, just quantitative answers. We analysed by church affiliation, the age of the pastor, the length of time in ministry, the size of the church, and the location of the church, whether it was rural, a smaller town, a city, or Paris. What we discovered, to our surprise, was the results were pretty homogeneous, the same, whatever analysis you did. There are just a few points where a rural area would not be the same as a big city, for example. And there are a few small differences among age groups. For example, older people did not like direct contact in the streets, but younger people did, for example. But overall, although they were anonymous answers, I couldn't tell the difference, even though I knew the church affiliation, whether it was someone from a Pentecostal church or a Baptist church or a Brethren Assembly. I was very surprised by that. It was almost impossible to see, and the results were very similar. So we had a lot of results. I can't give you all the results, but I wanted to focus on one set of answers, which was, what is the best form of evangelism today? The question, what is the best form of evangelism today? I hope you can see, I find it difficult to choose colours, and I think the black is not very good, but choosing what is the best form. This says, encourage Christians to build relationships with non-Christians. That came out as the absolute top. 87.6% of the pastors put that as the overall, putting somewhat agree and strongly agree together, which is often done in this kind of survey, as being the way of evangelism today. It's also very interesting to see the others. Not that I'll spend so much time on the others, but it is interesting to see that the second highest thing that came out in the analysis was to identify those who have the gift of evangelist. And the question was a bit, all the questions were a bit richer than that. They identify those who have the gift of evangelist and give them the freedom to exercise this gift in your church and so on. But okay, you understand the basic thing. 74% said that. Almost the same figure said evangelism includes practical action, working with people who have addictions or dealing with loneliness or questions of family and so on. Being also involved in very practical matters on the ground. The fourth was you organize meetings with non-Christians specifically in mind. There's a little contradiction we'll see about this afterwards, which is, if you come back for a moment, between 2, 3 and 4, 74, 73, 73.4, almost the same, I would say, for meetings with non-Christians, specifically in mind. 72.6 thought that the best form of evangelism is church planting. We have a question around that, which is not my theme for this morning, but that we also have to think in terms of giving a new dynamic to churches which have been planted for some while and maybe have lost their zeal or their growth. Inter-church events were quite high, but interestingly enough, that was one of the points where there was a difference according to location. In towns and cities, that was put very highly. In rural areas in Paris, it didn't come out very high for different reasons. Direct street contact 63. This is the one that surprised us, though there are 2 points I wanted to bring out from this. Inviting Christians to ordinary church activities, only 55% said yes, and that's my theme. Of course, when you have a survey, you then interpret. Do you say, this isn't a good method? Or do you say, people haven't understood that it's a good method? So obviously we're in a kind of subjectivity, and one of our aims with our Evangelism Commission is to organise some more surveys among church members, among young people, and among non-Christians to see how they respond to the same questions. On the other hand, we found it was very low to put to opt for a nationwide evangelism event to try to have some kind of nationwide impact. I think not many, well, only 39% said that. I'll come backwards for a moment because, I said there are two things that surprised us. The first was, if you look actually for the figures of this, it came out by far the highest, but there's a much bigger discrepancy between somewhat agree and strongly agree than for all the other points. So most of them, it's sort of half and half, 31, 42, 37, 36. But that one, somewhat agree, was 73.9, and only 13.7 strongly agree. So again, we had to interpret, and our commission decided that our theory, which we need to test on that, is that in today's world, this seems to be the best way of doing things, but pastors are not convinced it's happening, or that church members know how to form relationships with non-Christians. And so we thought we need to test this theory, but there are some reasons which make us think that. Mainly, you won't be able to read this, and I neither have the time or the will to put all this into English. I'm sorry, I tell you. But this is now evangelism training. What training do you want? What is the top one? 75.3%. How to build a relationship with a non-Christian. That's why we interpreted the small number of strongly agree, as compared to somewhat agree, on the grounds that this is the best way, but will it happen? How can it happen? Because when we see this is by far the top thing that is requested for training, is how to build relationships. We were also surprised that the second one was to pray, how to pray, the role of prayer. And that we weren't expecting, that it would be so high in the list of, when we say, what evangelism training do you want? How to pray. To be honest, I wasn't expecting that to be so high in the list of requests. Two other things then this one is individual witnessing, how to be an individual witness, so we're very close to this. This one is also a little surprising, at 61%, understanding the gospel. Do the Christians really understand what the gospel is, and therefore want to evangelize? And this one here at 59% is how to reconfigure the church to be a place which welcomes non-unbelievers, to be accessible to unbelievers and so on, which is again going back to the backwards, inviting Christians to ordinary church activities. A lower number thought that this was important than the number of people asking for training on it, which has also made us think that maybe that the one reason it's low is that people didn't know how to do it. The other thing that surprised us was that a relatively low number asked for training in apologetics, understanding competitive world visions, whether it's religion or philosophy and so on. Weren't quite sure what to make of the fact that it was not requested, because usually when people talk in terms of evangelism in France, you immediately start thinking, you've got to understand what Muslims think and what philosophers think and so on. But we concluded that this was important. It's still 35%, but maybe, as in the first instance, not the real motivation. This is a tool that came afterwards to improve your relationship with people, but not the fundamental thing. Okay, so there's lots of figures. If you want the PowerPoint, I can send it to you. We can make a list or something if you're interested in having the figures. But this was just a lead-in to say evangelism through the normal life of the church, that it's quite high, that people are saying we need to learn how to reconfigure the church and be a welcoming church, and even higher, that each person, as the church which is dispersed in the world all through the week, and place to work, and friends and family, should be witnesses to the gospel. So that is a kind of introduction to say why I think that evangelism through the normal life of the church is fundamental. 3 points about evangelism today. Still in the idea of the normal life of the church. Evangelism is a process. In one sense, it always has been. Children went to Sunday school, they went to the youth group, they understood the gospel and so on. But if there are fewer people who are being reached out to as children, partly because of laws on relationships between children and adults and so on, it's, at least in some countries that's quite tough. The idea that we are on a journey, we're on a pilgrimage, does touch people's hearts. Where are we going? And I'm on a journey somewhere. That kind of vocabulary people understand. I also, a few years ago now, read a PhD thesis by a Baptist pastor in France who came out with the astounding figure that he thought on average that someone had to hear the gospel 5.9 times before they become a Christian. Now, if you think it's 5.8, I'm not going to discuss with you, but whether you agree with the figure or not, I think it's true that people are so far from the gospel, they have to hear it several times. So although it's good that you might just talk to someone on a train or something, if it's in the context of a relationship, then people are more likely to hear the gospel several times, because you have the opportunity to come back on different occasions to talk about the gospel. In other words, this process is very important. There is so much ignorance of people. I remember talking to a student from a leading engineering school in Paris who affirmed to me that he had never heard that Christians thought that Jesus was risen from the dead. He's a guy of about 20 in a leading engineering school. This ignorance is there. So just the one-shot thing doesn't work. In God's grace, it might with a few people, but as I sometimes said with students, the first time you ask a girl out, all you want is that she'll agree to come out with you a second time. You're not going to go any more than that the first time. You don't usually ask someone to marry you the first time you go out. And so, in a sense, we're building a relationship, and this relationship can happen within just the normal life of the Christian, and the Christian will then be the link with the church. Just a few statistics for that. I haven't got them on the PowerPoint. That on a survey, another survey that was done. This was done about 15 years ago, but I think it's probably still very relevant. The question was asked to within the denomination I work with, Transmission, what was the main thing that brought you to Christ? And there was a kind of there were two figures, because the way the survey was set up meant that you could answer two things. Between 3 and 6% said the Sunday school. Between 3 and 6% the pastor. Between 60 and 80% someone I knew, a friend, family, work colleague. So we might be spending a lot of time and energy working out, doing all sorts of events and everything, but 60 to 80% just people meeting people. On the other hand, the third aspect of evangelism today, which is why I come back to my theme of the life of the church, is that we should also be aiming for visibility in the public arena. So if a local church exists, we should be doing the best we can. And in France, with what we call laïcité, which is a sort of a philosophical and political definition of secularism as a choice rather than as a sociological observation, we still manage to have, as a church, a certain amount of contact with the local authorities. When I lived in the suburbs of Paris, I was invited with the priest, the rabbi, and the imam to make a speech every year at the war memorial in the town on the 8th of May. And this is a fantastic opportunity just to explain a bit who we are. Another very down-to-earth thing is that I've always insisted that where my church is, there should be a link from the municipal website to the website of my church. We are a public institution. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be mentioned on the municipal website. So we have a public visibility as much as we can. According to the town or city you're in, it's more or less difficult, but I think it's important to aim for that. Okay, that is the basic premises of what I think we should be trying to do as a church. 3 implications of this. I don't have so much on PowerPoint for that, but you've got it, I think, normally in your binder. If you see the first one, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at the details of it, because that's up to you to look at. But it's my definition of what a church is. This definition I've suggested in all sorts of meetings when I teach in Bible schools and so on, and no one has yet added anything to it, so I think it must be about right. I just read it quickly. A local church is a group of Christians who meet together to devote themselves to the apostles' teaching, fellowship, the breaking of bread and prayer, that's Acts 2:42, who welcome all those who believe in Jesus, Romans 15:7 that says, welcome all those who Christ has welcomed, who meet together physically, who have recognized leadership. Of course, you can say a lot about what kind of leadership and what they do. This is just the main lines. Where each person can use their spiritual gifts, where baptisms take place and the Lord's Supper is observed, where love is the distinctive sign, John 13:35, who are involved in society and proclaim salvation. And I put those together because 1 Timothy 2 starts with praying for the authorities and moves on to the gospel. It's a very interesting way in which you start. Paul starts with one subject and leads on to the fact there's only one mediator between God and man. So, for me, what you've got there on that page is the minimum criteria for a local church. When you got that, you go to local church. Adapted, maybe it'll look different in Paris than it would in Sofia or Madrid. Might look even more different between Paris and a rural area. Might look even more different between Paris and a church among the pygmies in the forest. It might look very different between what I am doing in my church in Paris today and what Calvin was doing in Geneva at the time of the Reformation. But I think these are the essential points you would find in each church. When you say that, there is an implication that if this is the minimum, if you're doing that, then the way you do it allows you enormous flexibility. Much more than most people think that we have. All the rest is flexible and optional. Just to give a strange example, the mission and denomination I work with once had an article about a church who started saying that we started a second weekly worship service on a Saturday evening instead of a Sunday. No other subject brought so many letters to the editor saying, you shouldn't be doing this on a Saturday. The Lord's Day is a Sunday, this is when you should be doing it. Where do you find this in the scriptures? It's amazing how much people were attached to something which was not on this list of minimum requirements. I sometimes quote an example of that. It's a church I heard about in London that decided the best time that they should organise their outreach Bible studies was on a Sunday evening at 12 o'clock in the evening, at midnight. If I tell you that it was a Chinese church reaching out to people working in Chinese restaurants, then you understand why. Most churches wouldn't do it at midnight on a Sunday. But in their case, it made perfect sense. So we have to think as well, how do we adapt to the society we're in? In my particular case, in Paris, we now have a second service on a Sunday evening at 7:30, followed by pizzas. Because a lot of young people in Paris don't know that Sunday morning exists. They're a bit late on Sunday morning. Or they go away for the weekend out of the city and come back at the end of the afternoon on Sunday. They can come. Or we have older people who come. We're very happy to have a more meditative Sunday evening service without all the children running around and shouting and so on. So there are various reasons for it. So it's not just young people, it's a range of people. So in other words, as I put on the paper you have, in that sense, soteriology trumps ecclesiology. I mean by that communicating the gospel, salvation, is more important than reflection on ecclesiology, although the two obviously go together and should really be completely together. But I'm talking of ecclesiology in the sort of the secondary debates around ecclesiology rather than ecclesiology itself. Okay, so that was the first point. The implications of evangelism being part of the normal life of the church is that we have to learn flexibility for that, so that someone coming to the church, and I think this happens more and more, strangely enough, in today's world, someone may turn up or be invited to the church. They need to feel welcomed. They need to feel that they have their place. They need to feel that they have time and space to go on their journey without being jumped on straight away, to give them the chance to discover what Christianity is about, and just to see what are we doing. If someone needs prayer, we stop and pray. In our church, we have a fellowship meal 2 or 3 times a month after the morning service, and most people stay. So we have a time of fellowship and sharing on things. Okay, sometimes around the meal, you might start with the result of the match last night, and then, but sooner or later, you're sort of you move on to other topics, and you never know what you're going to talk about. But it's interesting. People feel that we're being ourselves, and that's very important. The second point is that we need to learn, the way I put it was, to live seamlessly. Do you know what a seam is? A seam is on a piece of clothing, where 2 bits are put together. But we want our life to be one, if you like. And I think evangelism doesn't work if you consider it to be, we've got our normal Christian life, and we just add on a little bit, which is evangelism. It doesn't work. So I developed a whole lot of teaching in our church using the word today. I'm not necessarily going to read those verses. You can look them up. Hopefully it says today in your translation as well. There's one little mistake on the paper. It's not 1 Peter 3:18, but 3:15. Don't know how the mistake happened. And so I was saying and teaching in the church that we need to worship God today, where we are, even standing on the platform of the metro, or at your job, or at home and everything else. Try to be developing an attitude of continual worship. The same for trusting God today. In everything we do, we have to learn to trust God. Little things, big things, but we're trusting God all day, whether we're at work or at home or wherever. Fighting the good fight, obeying God today, as Hebrews 3 says about the seduction, the temptation of sin, to be fighting today, every day. And I think one of the big problems that we have sometimes in our church life is that we come into the church into a kind of bubble. And in this bubble, we sing certain songs, and we feel good, and then we sort of come out of the bubble, and so we don't quite know how to live outside the bubble. So even in the suburban train, we put on our earphones and still listen to the same songs that we sung on the Sunday morning to sort of try to maintain this feeling. Whereas if during the service as such, I don't even like the word service really, but and I don't know what to call it, the gathering, we are talking about our lives wherever we are, how we can worship God and obey God and trust God in everything we're doing. Then we're not in this bubble. I think it's very important to do that. So that, for example, going in the other direction, I, from time to time, although I like consecutive preaching, I try to illustrate it with what's going on. I preached recently a whole message on Noah because of the film that you may have seen, if you've seen it. 1 or 2 bits aren't very scriptural. But it's important to see it. And I said to the church, you must go and see it, because people at work are going to talk about it. And if you haven't seen it, how can you say, what the Bible is teaching and correct and say, yeah, but that was good. One thing was good in it, God really does judge sin, for example. That's good. That's true. So, having been through those three things, worshipping God, trusting God today, fighting a good fight. The fourth one is to do good to the person that God brings into my life today. And that's the adventure. You don't know who you're going to meet and how and who might ask you a question. And so it wasn't just evangelize, but do good to the person. And part of that is to preach the gospel. I made little cards with all that for the Christians to put in their Bibles or their pockets or something to remember this is what we need to do today. So we're living seamlessly. So if we are worshipping God during the coffee break at work or fighting some kind of temptation, and someone then talks about something, the Lord is there. It's part of your life. You're living seamlessly. And I think this is very important. So within the church, we can encourage each other to do that. I mentioned Hebrews 3. I haven't looked at those verses, but you can find them, which talks about encouraging one another. So the whole point is, when we're around the meal table after the service, someone might say, well, yeah, I had a problem at work because someone said this, and what should I have said, and so on. So we talk about it. It's important. Living life seamlessly. And so the third aspect of that, as far as church is concerned, living as a community, is to do this in tune with your particular culture. When we do a course which I've made in France called Bridges Passerelles, we do it in our church. It's a bit like Alpha, but it's shorter and it's a bit different. We start with an aperitif, because that's what you have in France. What do you do in the evening? You start the evening with an aperitif. So that's part of being cultural. But it goes much deeper than that. It's the question, how can we be like others but Christian? That's contextualization is very complicated, and we'll probably talk about that because it's the issue that we're facing. On the one hand, we want to be as like others as possible, but in some places we're going to fight part of the culture. But my opinion is that if you're not contextualized, then there's no way you can fight that part of the culture because people think you're outside it, criticizing this culture. You have to be within it to be able to criticize. So we have a whole lot of issues around that. I haven't got very much time to go into it, but these are the questions that we need to ask. Is since evangelism is part of the normal life of the church, how do we help each Christian to live his new identity in Christ? What does it mean? The way I sometimes put it is, what does it mean to say that Jesus is the only Saviour and the only Lord? Let's talk about it. What does this mean when you download certain things without paying? What does it mean if you use your office photocopier for photocopying things? What does it mean if you don't pay when you go onto the metro, you jump over the barrier? A lot of people do in Paris. I use that for evangelism because when someone does it in front of me, I say, God saw you. That's some very interesting discussions with people. I choose the person, certain people I wouldn't say it to. How do we encourage diversity within the local fellowship? That's very important, to accept that people are very different to each other, very different. And we want to have this diversity because each one has got their range of friends. We want them to feel that they are accepted within the local fellowship. Genuine and meaningful conversations in our church life, within our French context. that means, and it's the third time I've said it, that means sitting down to have a meal, very often, or for a drink. That is when you talk. To have meals here which just last a few minutes, it's impossible. When we have our student camps, for example, and I've been speakers at various countries of the world at IFE's camps, our camps, the midday meal lasts for about 2 hours at a student camp. Just as soon as you put your feet under the table, you start talking. That's what people talk in France. You talk because you're eating. You eat to talk. That is the way it works. But each person has to find how it works in their culture. Maybe in the UK it means going to the pub or something. I don't know. I don't live in the UK. But we have to think how it works. We want to welcome unbelievers, point D, and let them, the expression I like, walk in our landscape. They see how we're living. There was when the CNEF that I mentioned earlier was founded, had its first major meeting, there were reports in the newspapers and in Le Monde, which is the best French newspaper, there was an article in which they used the sentence, they even pray about someone who is taking an exam. This was a surprise to the journalists. Why do you pray about someone taking an exam? But this is what we do. We pray about things. We try to forgive each other. We try to understand each other. We try to support each other. And people are going to walk in this landscape. We want to help Christians interact with people regarding their culture and current issues. Okay, that's an interesting, enormous thing. Building relationships with unbelievers, but recognizing the risks involved. I put John 17, 15 to 18, because it says, as we were sent into the world, as Christ was sent into the world, he sends us. But it also says, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is the truth. So we do also need to protect people as they build relationships with unbelievers. Connecting with local authorities and local religious and secular leaders, I mentioned that. I'm just doing a sort of brief run through of issues. How to maintain our freedom of speech in the public arena. It's very important for us. Within France, we are trying to develop the idea that talking to God is a religious activity. So we don't necessarily want to do that in the public arena. But talking about God is a question of freedom of speech. And that's why we should always have the right to talk about God, because talking about God is not a religious activity. Talking to God is, not talking about God. And a lot of people in France don't make that difference. So we're working on that. And again, how to decide what are the best times to meet as a church and the best ways.